Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. For those that are sensitive to gluten, brewing and drinking traditional 100% barley malt beverages isn't an option. Making gluten-reduced beer from barley requires using exogenous enzymes or clarifiers, but you still likely can't get rid of all the gluten. Alternative gluten-free grains are an option, but there are technical and sensory challenges with some of those ingredients. I'm your host, Cade, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Dr. Nazarena Cela, who made a goal of her PhD research to produce a gluten-reduced beer that consumers like and enjoy. There were challenges along the way, of course, including deciding which methods or which alternative grains to pursue. I'll chat with her about those prior studies, looking at whether using enzymes or alternative grains or clarifiers or what have you would produce a beer that consumers like. And then we'll dig into her work with sorghum and quinoa, exploring how using those alternative grains impacts brewing and sensory characteristics, and also discuss how adjusting the protein rest may or may not be a useful tool in gluten-reduced brewing. The ultimate goal, of course, is to share Nazarena's extensive knowledge about how you might use alternative grains and different brewing techniques to make great gluten-reduced beers. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Becoming a patron is easy. Once you've contributed at that $3 level or higher, you get access to the private Patreon Facebook page where all of the previous Q&A sessions are available to watch. So guests like Vinny Cilurzo, John Palmer, and the Brewlosopher himself, Mr. Marshall Schott. All the information that you need to get access to this awesome resource is available at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. So please go check it out. I want to say another big thank you to everyone that's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet, please do so. It's really awesome. It really helps us out. I read every review, and I love hearing from you. As I've said before, we wouldn't have the Applying the Science episodes with Jordan if not for listener reviews, so I'm interested to see what else you'd like to see from the show. If you haven't yet left a rating or review, please take a moment to help us out. All right, feedback this week is from me. I have a couple corrections from the last few weeks of things that I got wrong. Oopsies. All right, so a few weeks back, Jordan asked me how to say the word chelating, which describes how binding metals or a way to bind metals or minerals. And when it's written, it looks like chelating, Chelating, with the sh sound. And that's how I told him to pronounce it on air. No, I was wrong. It's chelating is how it's pronounced. So again, if you're talking about things binding to a metal or a mineral, it would be chelating, and that's the way to pronounce it. I realized it after the show was published, and it was too late to edit it in. So here's a correction. Also, on the feedback in last week's episode, Danny wrote in about limit dextrinase, and he was talking about a method for mashing in high at like 65 Celsius and then ramping down and lowering the pH so that you could get increased limit dextrinase activity in addition to alpha amylase and beta amylase. And I got the enzyme activity details wrong. I said that limit dextrinase works on the same bonds as alpha and beta amylase. I said specifically it works on the 1,6 linkages, the same as the amylase. Nope, wrong on two fronts. Amylases work on the 1,4 linkages, linkages, whereas limit dextranase does in fact work on the 1,6 linkages. So I got the linkages that the amylase work on wrong, and that they work on the same linkage. So as Danny suggested, you might be able to get a few more gravity points of extract by doing that reversed step mash. Again, mashing higher than 65 Celsius, reducing the temperature and pH down to promote limit dextranase activity. All right, apologies for those mistakes. I'll be back in just a few seconds talking with Dr. Nazarena Cela about gluten-reduced brewing. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Corient. Corient provides wealth management services centered around you. They focus on exceeding your expectations and simplifying your life. Corient has been helping high achievers just like you enjoy their lives more fully, preserve their wealth, and provide for the people, causes, and communities they care about. As one of the largest integrated fee-only registered investment advisors in the U.S., Corient has deeply experienced teams in 23 strategic locations. Corient has extensive knowledge spanning the full spectrum of planning, investing, lending, and money management disciplines. Leverage Corient's exclusive network of experts to craft custom solutions designed to help you reach your financial goals, no matter how complex they may be. Real wealth requires real solutions. For more information, connect with a wealth advisor today at Corient.com. That's Corient.com. Corient.com.
You know how to book flights and hotels. All you're missing is a tool to plan the travel experiences you'll have once you arrive. That's why you need Viator. Book guided tours, activities, excursions, and more in one place to make your trip truly unforgettable. Viator has over 300,000 travel experiences to choose from. Everything from simple tours to extreme adventures and all the niche, interesting stuff in between. So you can plan something that everyone you're traveling with will enjoy. Real traveler reviews give the inside scoop from people who've already been on the experiences you're considering. So you can plan with confidence. Free cancellation helps you plan for the unexpected. And 24/7 customer support means you can travel worry-free. Download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking in the app. Find travel experiences for you. Do more with Viator.
Traditionally, at least according to the Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law, beer is made out of malt, water, yeast, and hops. But there's a large and growing segment of the population that have adverse reactions to gluten, which is present in barley and makes it into the final beer. There are a number of ways to brew gluten-free beers, and today on the show I'm talking to Nazarena Cela of the University of Basilicata in Potenza, Italy. Nazarena, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Hi, Cade, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this interview and podcast. And I'm really excited to share my insight in the world of gluten-free beer.
Well, I'm excited to see, to have some insight in here too. We've done a couple of episodes on gluten-free brewing before, but you know, beer's one of those beverages that's been brewed for thousands of years, and for at least the past 100 years or so, mainly with malted barley as the main sugar source. But was that always the case? I mean, I understand sort of that cultures usually brewed beer with whatever cereal grain they had that was available.
Yes, indeed. The beer is a traditional brew with barley malt, water, hops, and yeast. But barley malt is not allowed in a gluten-free diet. So in the last year, different approach to produce gluten-free beer had to be developed, and so one of the aim of my PhD was the optimization of microbrewing process for the production of high quality gluten-free beer, taking into account both physicochemical and sensory attributes.
Ah, yeah, exactly. And so it is interesting too, because, there are challenges associated with brewing gluten-free that don't exist in normal barley brewing. And I'm excited to talk to you about those challenges today, and also talk to you about your PhD research. And I always like to start the show by getting to know somebody. So I'll ask the first question of you. How far are you in your PhD research?
Yeah, first of all, let me introduce myself.
Yeah.
I received a PhD in food science and technology at the University of Basilicata. But currently, I'm a research fellow in another University of Gastronomic Sciences in Pollenzo. And my interest in gluten-free brewing born with my PhD activity, because the aim, as I said before, was to develop a new gluten-free beer, but not using enzymatic treatment, but using alternative grains. Alternative to barley malt. For example, by using sorghum, quinoa, or amaranth buckwheat millet that are naturally gluten-free grains. For sure, these alternative grains have some negative aspect in terms of the technological aspect, and also from sensorial point of view. So we performed all the PhD activities, activities in a scale-up approach, starting from a laboratory scale to a micro-industrial scale.
Wow. Yeah. Cool. And I'm excited to talk to you about a lot of that today. We are going to focus on one of the research projects that you did, which was maybe, I'll ask you this in a minute, but maybe it feels like sort of the culmination of the PhD research, which was to try to produce a beer with sorghum and quinoa that the consumers liked and enjoyed and would drink at the same level as a barley-based or malted barley-based beer. So I'm excited to talk to you about that today. And the cool part about that is there's kind of two aspects to look at here. There's one about like the actual ingredients themselves, like quinoa and sorghum, and how much of those to use in the beer. But you also explored a technological application, like using a protein rest in order to change or improve quality. So I'm excited to talk about some of those aspects, but also just generally talk about methods for brewing gluten-free beer and hear about your PhD research, which sort of led to this paper. But I think the most logical place to start then is, and I have discussed this on a couple of other podcasts, but we do have to mention it. So why brew gluten-free beer? What's the purpose of brewing gluten-free beer?
Yeah. As I said, beer is one of the most ancient and consumed beverage in the world. But since it produced mainly from barley malt that contain gluten, gluten is a protein fraction of wheat, rye, barley that to which some person are intolerant. For this reason, beer is not considered the safe for celiac people. In fact, today the only therapy against the celiac disease is to follow a strict gluten-free diet, avoiding foods and beverage containing gluten. And even if during all brewing process there is a natural gluten reduction, most of beers still contain a gluten content above the gluten-free safe threshold, such as 20 ppm established by regulation, safety regulation. Therefore, nowadays, different strategies to produce gluten-free beers have been developed in the last year in order to satisfy the requirements of people with these nutritional issues. Also, because the celiac disease is increasing in last period, and so it is very important to produce a beer, a gluten-free beer, also because why should celiac give up one of the most ancient and consumed beverage in the world? We have to be all very inclusive with each people.
Right, of course. So why would they want to give up something that tastes so wonderful and that's so wonderful to drink? Exactly. And it is great. And like you said, there are people who are learning that they're gluten intolerant, right? So the number of people that are having challenges or trying to do gluten reduced diets or are being diagnosed with celiac disease is increasing. And a lot of people just looking to improve health for health reasons are preferring to drink beverages that don't have gluten in them or avoid eating gluten for health reasons. And so brewing gluten-free beer is something that is important to people as we go forward and consider new beverages and new ways to brew. And so you mentioned on your PhD that you had started looking into a lot of research in this area, looking at gluten-free beer and how to brew and some of the technological challenges. So what are some of the common options for brewers if they want to brew gluten-free or gluten-reduced beers?
In literature, there are different approach to produce a gluten-free beer. One of this approach is the use of naturally gluten-free cereal or pseudo cereals. However, this approach and the use of these alternative grains could negatively affect the aroma, the taste of the final beer, so the sensory parameter, the sensory quality of the final beer, and also the use of these alternative grains have some technological issues. One of the most common approach to produce gluten-free beer nowadays is the use of enzymatic treatment. For example, the use of enzyme, a specific enzymes, such as the prolylendopeptidase from Aspergillus niger is the most common, and you can find in shop very easily. And it is also very easily to use, because you can start directly from a wort produced with 100% of barley malt, and you can directly add during fermentation at the initial phase of fermentation, and to reduce completely the gluten content below the safe threshold of 20 ppm. However, this approach, the use of enzyme, have some negative aspect in terms of the impact on the sensory characteristics, mainly on the foam stability, on the foam quality, because some previous literature research state that the application of this enzyme reduce a lot the foam stability of the beer, and we know that the foam is a very important aspect for the beer overall liking and for the consumer acceptability of final beer. Moreover, there are contrasting opinions about the use of enzymatic treatment because the enzyme produce allow an extensive hydrolysis of the gluten proteins. But these small peptides are not completely detected by the official method used to detect the gluten content. So it's not very safe. The safer alternative could be the use of naturally gluten-free grains such as sorghum, quinoa, and so on.
Millet, buckwheat, all that stuff. Yeah, that's actually I've had two separate guests on the podcasts talk about using something like, I think one of the trade names for that Aspergillus niger is Clarity Firm, and that's one of the ones that it was originally used as a clarifying agent, right, to help at fining at the end of fermentation. You would add it, and then your beer would be clearer. And of course, that's pulling out proteins because that is haze, right? Haze is part protein. And so if you pull out the proteins, then you don't have as much haze. And so they realized, hey, okay, this is reducing things down. And now we've pulled out this protein, so that means our gluten content is reduced. And some people started measuring it. And then the currently available assays, the ways to measure the amount of gluten, we're showing that it was lower than that 20 ppm level that you mentioned. And it turns out that there's actually some question, right? There's a dispute about whether the assay accurately measures the gluten or if there's still gluten that's available. For example, I think proline was one of the things that is very sensitive, that is an enzyme or a part of the protein, an amino acid that is celiac individuals are susceptible to, and it's not even detected sometimes by these assays. And so, yeah, there's quite a question of, even if you start with barley malt, but use these enzymes, you may still have gluten present in your beer. And I had one guest who is a dedicated 100% gluten-free brewer here in Oregon, and he said, I'll never forget the quote. He said, "The only way to be 100% sure that your beer is gluten-free is to brew with ingredients that are gluten-free." I'm sure you would agree with that, right, Nazarena?
Yeah, I agree. But this is not possible, depend on the regulation of your country. For example, in Italy, if you start to brew with 100% gluten-free grains, it is not possible to define the final product as beer. Because in Italy, for example, we have a legislation on beer definition that we can define a final beer only if we use 60% of barley malt. If we use 100% of other grains, we have to define the final product as a fermented beverage, but not a beer. So I agree that the only solution to define to have the security that our product is 100% gluten free with a gluten content below 20 ppm is to use only gluten-free grains, but it is not possible to define that according to the legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So there's a legal component of this that has to be a certain percentage of barley, 60% in Italy. And I looked this up to see if I could understand the regulations in the United States, to see what those ones were. But my background is formally as a lawyer, and even I was reading those regulations and going, I don't know if I can brew with gluten-free grains and call it a beer or not. It just says malt or any other substantially similar cereal grain or something like that. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? Substantially similar cereal grain. And then it lists a couple of things that are substantially similar cereal grains. But then there's all this just sort of circuitous, like keep going down another rabbit hole. So I couldn't tell, but I do know that in 2020, there was a regulation that was put in place in the United States that essentially was saying that if you want to label something as gluten-free, it has to be made with gluten-free ingredients here in the United States. So that is a relatively new law that has been in place in the United States. So if you are using Clarity Firm, for example, to use a 100% all malt barley beer, my understanding is in the United States that cannot be called gluten-free. It could be called gluten-reduced, I understand, but not gluten-free. So there, you mentioned, so there's this like legal challenge as well, right? In Italy, you can't substitute 100% of the grains. But you also mentioned that there may be some sensory characteristics that might be a little bit different. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the grains that are gluten-free that might be used to brew gluten-free beers?
Maybe I can explain and respond to this question by reporting my experience, for sure.
Great.
For example, during the first PhD activities, we select 5 gluten-free cereals or pseudo-cereals to use in brewing process in order to assess both their brewing parameters and their sensory aspect of the final beer. So we start with sorghum, quinoa, buckwheat, millet, and amaranth, and we use these alternative grain in a maximum percentage of 40% in the total grist composition. We brew this beer in a laboratory scale, very, very small pilot plant, 23 liters, such as a non-brewing equipment. And on the final beer, we performed a physicochemical and sensory analysis. Results from the physicochemical analysis showed that the use of particular alternative grains affect mainly the extra content of the initial wort that have some results in the alcohol content of the final beer. In terms of sensory aspect, we can state that the amaranth is completely, how to say,
not good for use. Yeah.
Not good. Exactly. Not good for beer because the consumer acceptability is expressed in terms of overall liking of final beer was completely not sufficient for a market purposes and was not good, the final beer. So for sure we suggest not to use amaranth in brewing.
Okay.
But we are very happy for the brewing performance of sorghum and quinoa. In fact, sorghum and quinoa were selected for the subsequent activities during my PhD, and then we have used these 2 alternative grains, sorghum and quinoa, to optimize the brewing process and the recipe for the development of a gluten-free beer. We select the sorghum and quinoa also because the beer produced with 40% of sorghum and the other beer produced with 40% of quinoa showed an overall liking by consumer very, very high. For example, in sensory analysis, we use an hedonic scale ranging from 1, meaning extremely dislike, to 9, extremely like. And beer brewed with sorghum, with 40% of sorghum, and beer brewed with 40% of quinoa were rated around 7. Were the most preferred by consumers.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, that's interesting. Of those 5 different grains, so of like buckwheat and millet, sorghum, amaranth, and quinoa, the sorghum and quinoa were the most preferred by consumers. And again, that's 40% of the alternative grain, and still 60% of barley malt, right? Some because of the Italian restrictions on calling the product beer. Well, that's very interesting. So those, it seems like sorghum and quinoa might have the best chance for consumer liking. But I'm curious about so then. Well, actually, maybe. So, what was the next step? So, you first looked at these 5 different grains and determined that sorghum and quinoa would be the best to go forward. Did you go straight to the experiment we're talking about today, which was just looking at the different percentages of sorghum and quinoa, and then also the protein rest, or was there some interim work that also happened?
For the optimization process, we select 2 variables. The grist composition, in order to choose the proper combination between sorghum and quinoa, in order to not adversely affect both brewing parameters and the hedonic ratings of final beer. But then we choose also another variable that is the protein rest, the protein step during the meshing process, because we hypothesized that a longer protein rest could affect the gluten content. So we perform a central composite design. Is the statistical technique that we use to optimize and to identify this proper combination of sorghum and quinoa. In order also to reduce the number of experiments that we have to perform, because to combine to identify the proper combination, we need to choose a very clear, a logical criteria to select the proper combination. So we select this statistical technique called the central composite design. And then we select also our goal, because our aim was to optimize the overall liking by consumer. Our aim was to maximize the overall liking by consumer, but also another variable very important for us was the extract content, because one of the main issues when you use alternative grains, alternative to barley malt in brewing, is the negative aspect, the negative influence on the extract content of the final wort. Because the gluten-free grains have some technological issues related to their gelatinization temperature, and because the use of gluten-free grains resulted in a longer saccharification time. So we need to balance these aspects, the sensorial and the technological aspect, and to optimize the old brewing process. We performed this central composite design, and our main results was that the best performing recipe was produced with percentage of sorghum and 6% of quinoa, and by performing 20 minutes of protein rest. Also because we noted that if we extend protein rest over the 20 and over 30 minutes, a protein rest longer than 30 minutes have a negative aspect on sensory quality of final beer, mainly on the foam stability. So we suggest to the brewery that want to produce a gluten-free beer, we suggest to perform a protein rest in between 20 and 25 minutes. Also because the protein rest is very suggested to perform when grains with high protein content are used in brewing.
Awesome. I'm excited to dive into these results with you too, because I want to look at that in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, we're going to take a short break. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Corient. Corient provides wealth management services centered around you. They focus on exceeding your expectations and simplifying your life. Corient has been helping high achievers just like you enjoy their lives more fully, preserve their wealth, and provide for the people, causes, and communities they care about. As one of the largest integrated fee-only registered investment advisors in the U.S., Corient has deeply experienced teams in 23 strategic locations. Corient has extensive knowledge spanning the full spectrum of planning, investing, lending, and money management disciplines. Leverage Corient's exclusive network of experts to craft custom solutions designed to help you reach your financial goals, no matter how complex they may be. Real wealth requires real solutions. For more information, connect with a wealth advisor today at Corient.com. That's Corient.com. Corient.com.
I've heard many stories of brewers that had to hang up their brewing hats because they found out they were sensitive to gluten. Brewing beers with malted barley wasn't possible for them, and the beers made with alternative grains didn't exactly have the same flavor or brewing characteristics that they were used to. I'm curious, Nazarena, is there a wide gluten-free beer selection in Italy, or gluten-reduced beer selection?
In Italy, most gluten-free beers are produced with enzymatic treatments due to their operational simplicity. However, the use of clarification aids like, for example, silica gel or tannins can impact the final beer's appearance and aroma. But the most used and common in Italy are gluten-reduced beer. to make an example on the sensory quality of the beer produced with this different gluten-free approach. For example, I have performed a comprehensive comparison, a study to understand the comparison between the beer produced with these different approaches. I performed this study in Belgium during my research period abroad at Ghent Technology Campus, where we compare the beer produced with these different gluten-free approach. And we noted that even if the use of enzymatic treatment is the most useful in reduce gluten, this is an approach that adversely affects the sensory quality of beer. On the other hand, the use of silica gel is the approach that least impacted the sensory aspect of final beer, but depend also on the consumer perception of the final beer and how much they give a priority to the manufacturing process and the raw materials that you use to produce that beer. For example, in Italy, if you say that the beer is produced only with natural ingredients, without using enzymes or other clarification aids, it is better for the consumer, because consumer nowadays, mainly when you talk about craft beer, they prefer beer that is produced mainly with the natural ingredients. So they don't prefer when beer is produced with the addition of enzyme or other additives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you actually, mentioning silica gel, I think that's one of the technological challenges of using it is it can't remain in the beer, right? You've got to get it out.
Yeah, after filtration.
Yeah,
for example, another problem in Italy is that if we want to brew a craft beer, the legislation about craft beer in Italy doesn't allow the use of microfiltration and pasteurization. So if you want to remove silica gel with filtration, you cannot define the final product as craft beer.
Yet again, another legal requirement that's sort of making this challenging, right? For brewing gluten-free. If you use filtration to remove, so the silica gel from your previous studies had the best, or at least were the best for sensory aspects. It had the least impact on sensory. So the beers tasted the most like, barley beers. But then you've got this challenge. You can't, if you filter it to take the silica out, which you have to do, you're no longer craft beer. Interesting. Fascinating. All these different challenges. Now, before the break, you were telling us about the study that you were looking to optimize the best mix of sorghum and quinoa at that 40% mark to make the best sensorial gluten-free beer. But I also wanted to ask a question too. You mentioned before you were looking at the 5 different ingredients, and you mentioned that there were some differences in those, and you selected sorghum and quinoa as having sort of the best flavor characteristics. But were there also technical challenges with the sorghum and quinoa? Did they have better extract potential or things like that than the amaranth and the millet and buckwheat?
Yes, there are other parameters that we have had taken into account to select these 2 alternative grains, because every time on each beer we perform different physicochemical analysis, not only on the extract content but also pH, color of beer, free amino nitrogen, alcohol content for sure, and total nitrogen content. for example. And we note that when we use the sorghum and quinoa, these parameters are not very affected and are compared to a traditional brewing process when we use a 100% of barley malt. When we have selected our optimized formulation produced with 34% of sorghum and 6% of quinoa, we note that the physicochemical analysis of this optimized, of this best performing formulation have also a good physicochemical parameters. For example, if we use a higher content of sorghum, there was a negative correlation with these parameters, for example, also the also the sensory aspect was negatively affected. So we suggest that the grist composition, the grist ratio, the ratio between sorghum and quinoa is very important to choose because affect a lot the attributes both of wort and final beer. For example, we have noted that higher sorghum concentration leads to a lower extract because sorghum has a higher gelatinization temperature that is very high compared to the enzymatic, the amylolytic temperature, optimal temperature. Or, for example, another attribute very affected by the grist composition that we have selected was the glucose content, because we know that for the fermentation is very important the presence of maltose, of fermentable sugar. But even if glucose content is an important sugar to take into account during fermentation, when we use a lot of percentage of quinoa, also the gluten content increase. But there is some controversial,
conversion or controversy or some preference, yeah.
Yes, when we use quinoa, the glucose content increase, and it's not so good for the fermentation.
Yeah, there's some repression of that maltose that when the glucose increases. All right, I want to dig into these results a little bit more with you, because I think there's a lot here that's really interesting too, like using quinoa and sorghum in different amounts, but then also the impact that protein rest had. So I wanted to talk just for a couple of minutes then about how you brewed the beers. So again, this was because of Italian law, you are trying to brew beer, and so 60% of the grist composition was from barley. It was, I think, 54% pale malt, malted barley, and then 6% Carahel, which was the sort of barley-based grist composition. And then you varied different percentages of sorghum and quinoa. So what percentages did you test of sorghum and quinoa?
Yes, we use different percentage of sorghum and quinoa. We start from 6% of sorghum and 34% of quinoa, and vice versa. Or, for example, we brew it also and beer with 0% of sorghum and so 40% of quinoa, and the opposite. And also some beer produced with 20% of sorghum and 20% of quinoa. This combination, this percentage, is the percentage that resulted from the central composite design. And another variable that we managed was the protein rest that ranged between 20 minutes to 44 minutes. But 44 minutes was very, very too long and completely unuseful.
Yeah, which is interesting too. And you, so like you said, that other variable, that protein rest time, you were looking at too. And I believe you mentioned earlier, looking at the protein rest would be important because gluten is a protein, and so increasing the protein rest might therefore increase gluten.
We hypothesize that since gluten is a protein fraction, if we perform a longer protein rest, also the gluten content could be reduced, naturally reduced, because the protein rest is a particular step of the meshing process where the proteolytic enzyme hydrolyzes the gluten fraction, the protein fraction, and so our hypothesis was that by extending the protein rest, we reach a naturally gluten reduction. But this hypothesis was not confirmed because all these brewing, all these trial, or all of these brewing trials had still a gluten content above 20 ppm. So there was a significant impact of the protein rest time on the gluten content on the final beer. So this step, these activities, this optimization process was very useful for us to identify the most promising recipe in terms of grist composition, in terms of which gluten-free grains and which is the proper combination between sorghum and quinoa. But this optimized formulation then was further validated on pilot scale. For example, I validated this optimized formulation on pilot scale in Belgium, and also to implement technological adjustment in order to better control all of the brewing steps that could promote a naturally gluten reduction, and also to implement other technological adjustment to optimize the entire brewing process.
Yeah, of course, because the whole goal is to make a great tasting gluten reduced beer, but still fit into the Italian legal framework of a 60% barley based beverage. So I'll just run through really quickly the rest of the sort of beer recipe, which was the protein rest temperature was 50 Celsius or 122 Fahrenheit. And then there was a saccharification rest for 60 minutes at 67 Celsius, which is like 154 Fahrenheit. And then a mash out step really quick at 78 Celsius or around 180 Fahrenheit for 5 minutes. And then Amarillo hops were added for bitterness, and then some Perle and Cascade also added. So it was like a nice, well-rounded hoppy beer, fermented with USO5 for a nice clean beer, and then bottle conditioned to get those those beers into bottles that were then tasted. So then let's talk about some of the basic brewing characteristics then. And I have a question sort of like how the beers turned out from a physiochemical perspective. So were you able to make, quality beers that had like similar characteristics to 100% barley beers in terms of their physiochemical properties?
We can state that the sorghum quinoa ratio used in brewing influenced the attributes of wort and beer. For example, wort and beer sample brewed with a low sorghum concentration, such as 0 and 6% of sorghum, showed good brewing parameters. But there was a significant negative correlation between sorghum levels used in beer formulation and parameters, physicochemical parameters such as extract, free amino nitrogen, alcohol, total nitrogen content, and color of beer. And for example, also the protein rest time longer than 30 minutes showed a significant negative impact on the physicochemical attributes and also on consumer acceptabilities. Moreover, we can state that in general, the extra content is influenced when we use a higher concentration of sorghum, for example, and glucose content, as I said before, is also influenced by mainly by the quinoa content. But for example, in terms of color of final beer, we can state that the color is not completely affected by the grist composition, or depend of how much of sorghum and quinoa you use during brewing process. But in general, in terms, if we express the color of beer in terms of ABC unit, and if our goal is to produce a gluten-free beer that is not completely different from a conventional beer, we can state that the color is not completely affected. Also because, for example, we brewed our beer by taking into consideration we wanted to produce an American pale ale beer style. So the range of the ideal color of an American pale ale was the same of the color that we reach in our experimental beer samples.
Cool. Great. So they looked the same, or at least from a color perspective, using these sorghum and quinoa. One of the things you mentioned there, though, earlier, too, is this with extract. So the higher concentration of sorghum led to lower extract. And you mentioned earlier that sorghum has a higher gelatinization point. And that was something that one of my previous guests, JP Beerley, mentioned as well in his gluten-free brewing that was difficult, is that you have to get up to gelatinization temperatures in order to get at that extract. So while sorghum may have other characteristics like sensory and things that they like, that consumers like, you have this gelatinization challenge. And then on the opposite side, more quinoa had more glucose produced, and glucose, as you mentioned earlier, was associated with that what we call maltose repression in fermentation. So yeast prefers glucose, and so it'll just take up the glucose and ferment that. that, but then it doesn't secrete the enzymes to break maltose down into glucose. So that actually happens outside the cells, because it secretes this enzyme, and then the maltose gets broken down into its two glucose components. So it's kind of like you're trying to balance all of these different things. Like we're going to modulate the sorghum concentration and have enough quinoa that we get, the extract potential that we want. Because if we just did 40% sorghum, we'd have the lowest ABV. We wouldn't be able necessarily to hit our ABV targets. Is that right? That's sort of like a summary of the physiochemical issues there with the grist composition?
Exactly. This is the summary of the optimization process, because it's very important, the balance that have to have the final beer, and it's not very easy to individuate, to identify all the brewing parameters that you have to manage to set up in order to balance all these parameters. It's difficult or sometimes very impossible, depend on what you want to have in your final product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and as you mentioned already before, sort of the higher sorghum beers, it generally had good brewing properties. So this 34% sorghum and 6% quinoa was one that you identified as having good physiochemical brewing properties in this part of the study. But you also did sensory characteristics on this too, because obviously, if you it's not just about extract or color or those physiochemicals. It's how does it taste? And do the consumers like it? And so in this case, as I understand, you served it to 90 non-celiac consumers, again, because 60% of this beer is brewed with barley. So we weren't serving this to celiac consumers, and then asked them on that hedonic liking scale of, 1 being dislike extremely to 9 being like extremely, to rate the beer on their overall liking, their smell, the taste, the appearance, all of those things that we like from a beer. And then you also asked a question about willingness to buy, like how willing would you be as a consumer to buy this beer, from 1 being definitely would not buy it to 5 being definitely would buy it. So walk us through some of the sensory results. How did these beers end up tasting to consumers?
Yeah, we perform a sensory analysis because we think that the sensory analysis and mainly the consumer perception of final beer is very important if we want to develop a new product, and our goal is to promote also the commercialization.
Yeah, you almost got
commercialization.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's a big one. Yeah, you're good.
To promote the entering the market of this beer. And so we perform a sensory analysis with 19 non-celiac consumer. Each participant was asked to first of all to observe, smell, taste the beer, and then to express their overall liking in general, and then the liking for each sensory modalities. In terms of first of all odor, then taste, flavor, and mouthfeel, by using a 9-point hedonic scale, ranging from 1 extremely dislike to 9 extremely like. Then our goal was also to individuate the consumer purchase intention, and we asked to indicate their willingness to buy and willingness to pay for that beer. And we use these sensory results to select our best performing recipe, because, for example, our goal was to maximize the overall liking of final beer. So the beer produced with 6% of sorghum and 20 minutes percent of protein rest was the most performing experimental beers because it was the most preferred by consumers, considered as like moderately in a scale on a 9-point scale. Consumer rated that beer around 7. And also, probably the consumer are willing to definitely buy that beer, but are not very willing to pay too much for that beer. Depend on the context of consumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So they were willing to buy the beer. I think you guys mentioned in the study, it's like they pay €2.50 for a third of a liter, and probably would buy. But like you said, they're not willing to pay over or a high premium for the gluten reduction. But the interesting part to this to me too was one. I mean, the consumers liked this beer moderately on that 9-point scale, so ranging around a 7 on the 9-point scale. But you also compared this with an all malt pale ale brewed very similarly, right? So you've got your 6% sorghum, 34%. Oh yeah, was it 6% sorghum, 34% quinoa? Is that the beer that they liked the most, or what was the percentage that they liked the most? I forget.
Yeah, exactly. 6% of sorghum and 34% of quinoa.
Yeah, so 6% sorghum, 34% quinoa. They liked that beer the most, and you compared that to an all malt pale ale. And how did the consumers think it compared?
The consumer rate the beer brewed with 6% of sorghum and 34%, 34% of quinoa was considered more preferred by consumer compared than the conventional beer produced with 100% of barley malt. So, taking into account these incredible results, we suggest that if we use alternative grains in brewing, it is not a problem in terms of sensory quality of final beer. So the use of alternative grains to produce a gluten-free beer does not adversely affect the final consumer acceptability of final beer. So we suggest to use that. It is the same.
Yeah. Yeah. That you can make a gluten-free beer that has the same liking as the all malt pale ale, which is I think that's really awesome, because I have tasted gluten-free beers before that I like as much as I like all malt beers, and it's really cool to see that in this study that these are 90 consumers that reviewed this beer and scored it higher on the liking score than the 100% all malt pale ale, which to me is awesome and fascinating. And also means that you have come up with a nice mix here, at least from what you were trying to do in this study, using 6% sorghum and 34% quinoa. But the other aspect of this was that protein rest, and you were also able, through the sensory, to show that the protein rest played a negative role. The longer the protein rest, the worse the consumers liked the beer.
Yeah, exactly. With the longer protein rest time, we have a negative impact mainly on the appearance of final beer because the presence of foam is too low, and also the taste of final beer was completely adversely affected by a longer time of protein rest.
Yeah. So having that 40-minute protein rest was not good, even from the physiochemical properties, but also from the sensory perspective as well. But a beer brewed with 6% sorghum, 34% quinoa, with a protein rest of 20 minutes, 60% barley, had a very high, liked moderately, around a 7 on a 9-point scale, which is awesome. It's just amazing for a gluten-reduced beer to be that similar. So, all right, Nazarena, I always ask this question towards the end of the show. So if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Yeah, my advice to brewers is to thoroughly plan recipes. First of all, by conducting small-scale trials in a very critical logical and always considering consumer preferences, because in this case, for example, in the case of a new development, new product development, we have to take into account the consumer perception and the consumer acceptability of final beer. So when we optimized a new brewing process, we have to take into account not only the ingredients that we use, for sure, but we have to take into account the final consumer acceptability. So it is very important to perform sensory analysis with a 9 number of consumer in the panel, because otherwise the final results is not very reproducible and it's not very representative of the real context.
Yeah.
And for example, another suggestion, if some breweries want to produce a gluten-free beer, probably they can reproduce the same brewing recipe, but the sensory analysis need to be performed with celiac people in order to understand if the celiac people are very interested in this particular recipe that is very different from the gluten-free beer that you normally find on the market now, because sometimes when we found a gluten-free beer on the market, the most common are produced with enzymatic treatment, so have a completely different sensory profile. So probably the use of alternative grains and sensory quality of final beer produced with alternative grains is very different from the conventional gluten-free beer that you normally find on the market.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring at the end here too, right? Remember that because of the Italian laws about related to beer, there was still 60% barley in this. And you mentioned, Nazarena, earlier that there were all of the beers that were studied in this case still had the higher than 20 ppm on the gluten in this case. So they were not totally gluten-free, but hopefully gluten-reduced, right, using alternative grains. And so if you're interested in doing those sorts of brews, this also gives you some indication, especially if you are trying to do a 100% gluten-free beer. Understand that if you're doing that brewing with sorghum, you're going to have some extract issues in this case, right? Or or if you're brewing with quinoa, you're going to have to understand that glucose is going to be more produced. So there are significant takeaways from this study, even if you're interested in doing gluten-free or you want to use it in gluten-free brewing. But as I also mentioned on the show with JP Beerley, that these grains can be used in beer as additional flavorants, right? There's no you don't have to be gluten-free or gluten-reduced or any of that to try sorghum in a beer or try quinoa in a beer and see how it affects the flavor and the sensory and some of these other aspects, which I think are very interesting and a good way to do it. So, all right, well, Nazarena, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly helpful episode, especially with gluten-reduced brewing. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that we didn't get to today?
Yeah, thank you once again for this interview, and I suggest everyone to explore the world of gluten-free beer because it's very extensive and also very exciting. And maybe I could suggest to read different article on review present on the online related to this topic.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Nazarena has written several articles on gluten-free brewing, including a review on gluten-free brewing methods, which I think what she's referring to here. So, and of course, listeners, in the show notes, you will find links links to the articles that Nazarena has written. And Nazarena, thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Thank you.
All right.
And cheers.
And cheers. Yeah. Next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
It's Can. Over 50 years of endless deals.
Now, ShopRite does the can, serving lots on brands on everything in cans. Today is great to save some cash, so come to ShopRite's Can Bash. Can, you save much more on every brand.
Find endless deals at ShopRite's Can sale. Going on now. You can't miss it.